Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Falsifiable Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Denton, and today I have with me a very special guest. His name is Jeremy Shearmur, and he was an assistant to Karl Popper at one point for about 8 years, and he knows a lot about Popper and many other people. He is the author of books like The Political Thought of Karl Popper, and also Hayek and After Hayekian Liberalism as a research program. And he's edited or co-edited a book called The Cambridge Companion to Popper. And as we'll hear, he definitely has a lot of insight on all of this stuff. So welcome, Jeremy.
Thanks very much. I'm very happy to be with you.
All right. So what we were going to talk about today is Karl Popper and Charles Darwin and um, how their philosophies and theories intersect. To start out, though, Jeremy, I was going to ask you, what exactly do we mean whenever we say Darwinism? What is Darwinism?
Okay, look, this is a bit complicated, and in many respects, it's really an issue that would need to be addressed by a specialist on Darwinism, which I am emphatically not.
Mm.
Um, I know a reasonable amount about Popper. I've got interest in Darwinism, but I'm going to go and I'm going to say a few things about it. But probably if we had an expert on Darwinism with us, he, by the end of what I'm saying, would end up with less hair than I've got because he'd be tearing it out. Okay, first, there are different levels at which the question of what's going on when you're talking about Darwinism might be addressed. One might first of all say that it is the approach stemming from Darwin's work, which at a certain level offers an alternative to earlier religious-based views about the nature and character of species. A
Mm.
Darwinian approach stressed the idea that one could see what had been understood as a product of design as rather a product of random variation and then natural selection. And it's quite striking in this context that if you look, say, at the work of David Hume, who is no fan of religious ideas,
Hmm.
it's pretty clear, though, that he said, on this issue of design, there are things that look like that. There are also various things which really look problematic, but he and his contemporaries really didn't have a clear-cut, non-religious alternative. And what you got on the part of Darwin was the development of ideas which suggested how one could explain design-like features in the world as a product of variation and then selection.
Mm.
But one needs to note different kinds of complications. First of all, Darwin's own ideas were developed prior to our having knowledge about genetics, and in some context, one needs to distinguish between Darwin's ideas and neo-Darwinism, which brings together Darwinian ideas about natural selection and the sort of ideas about genetics that you got from Mendel's work onwards. It's also important to note that there are ideas too about sexual selection to be found in Darwin's work. That's to say, one might ask, why is it that certain things are occurring, like peacock's tails, or the absolutely alluring male pattern baldness that one gets on the farm. Now, the notion is that these aren't things which are uh, directly useful, but they're things which, at least in the case of the peacock, if not necessarily male pattern baldness and so on, you can explain in principle in terms of saying that there are issues to do with sexual selection at work, as well as narrowly functional stuff. There is also then, and my understanding is that there is ongoing controversy about this. There are issues about whether, from a Darwinian perspective, all change and innovation has to be small and incredibly piecemeal in its character, or whether you can have leaps, as it were. And there was a big controversy about this, for example, involving Gould on the side of big leaps, and you get Dawkins, who is championing the sort of small stuff. And there are a whole lot of things like this. There's also one other kind of notion that you get, and it's something that Popper himself had some ideas about, and also Sir Alister Hardy, about, in certain respects, possibilities of separation between physical developments and capacity developments. And the notion here is really that if you had, perhaps even if there is a big leap, the sudden development of wings on the part of a human, these wouldn't necessarily be of any use unless one already had, at least on a neutral basis, the development of capacities such that these things could be controlled. And what I'm saying is, from a relatively simple point of view, you can tell the Darwinian story. There is then this whole bunch of controversy about just what the ideas might amount to. And you might say that they're different sorts of problematics. You might say that within a broadly Darwinian approach, there are different research programs going on. And clearly, there is also this issue of whether or not there can be learning of a Lamarckian character. That's to say, whether, for example, if I were to put ideas which would be good for me into practice, if I were to go out running regularly and so on, whether any of this could be gained and transmitted. And you have, certainly within neo-Darwinism, the strong idea really that you don't get the possibility of the onward transmission of these learned characteristics. You have then various attempts being made by people who are strict Darwinians to find ways of accommodating certain of the phenomena that might fit into that. So what you have is a programmatic approach, different programs, in fact, but then various different variations within them, but where what you would need to get an up-to-date account is to invite onto the podcast someone who actually specializes in this stuff rather than an aging outside observer.
No, that's good. I mean, that's all. So interestingly, so Darwinism, that you just gave a great summation of it on many accounts. Like when you even went through the Gould controversy with Dawkins, which is he had the punctuated equilibrium, and Dawkins had gradualism, things go slowly, and so on and so forth. Darwinism, according to Daniel Dennett, is an algorithm, and the algorithm is simply keep what's useful, do away with what's not, or keep what's good and do away with what's bad. That's the selection that's happening. Um, And Dennett, in his book Darwin's Dangerous Idea, talks about how Darwinism is a universal acid. He uses this term because it tends to melt through every other thing. It has this ability to change philosophy, even though it started out as a biological explanation or it was in the realm of biology. It This algorithm, this keep what's good, do away with what's bad, sort of affects every other philosophical realm, and it has this, this universal reach to it, um, which is fascinating. And this is how I feel like we'll get into how it affects Popper's philosophy. Uh, but before I even get to that, though, there's a controversy around natural selection in the first place, which is evolution by natural selection scientific, or is it simply philosophic? What do you say to that, Jeremy?
Well, it's probably not a very helpful thing to say, but I think it depends a little bit what one is talking about.
Mm,
That's to say, if you look, for example, at Popper's writings on this, just as here as a source of examples, you have him at certain points rather earlier on, kind of saying, well, if you're talking about evolution with regard to the Earth, then this looks like a kind of single example historical thing, rather than something that's got the sort of generality and opportunities for testing that out that you'd look to for something to be fully scientific. There are other aspects, again, of Popper's work where he seems to suggest, well, it's almost a matter of situational logic rather than anything very sort of strongly empirical. On the other hand, you may have various different things being formulated which can actually be tested. One interesting but rather odd illustration of this are issues which can be found in the work of some critics of Darwinism.
mm,
There's a guy called Michael Behe, I think,
hmm
who wanted to argue that there are some problems about evolutionary theory on the grounds that, and he gives some specific examples to illustrate a point that has sometimes been argued against the theory of natural selection, namely the idea that there are some things which we have or which animals have or which play a useful functional role within organisms where it would seem as if, and this is his argument, you need to have, as it were, the whole thing at once as a working system, and where he wanted to argue there don't seem to be any precursors to this or any kind of gradualistic path which could possibly lead one up towards this. And he seemed to suggest that what one appeared to have was kind of islands of design in the middle of other things where he was willing to say, well, we can make sense of these in terms of ideas about natural selection.
mm,
Now, clearly, his claims in this context are something that is open to refutation. And indeed, some critics of his have said, there are actually, but you've been looking for them in the wrong area, things which would have been precursors of this and so on. And so you can have empirical arguments of this sort, although the more specific the claims are, the less they're open to completely universal testing in the way in which, say, claims in mechanics might have been. But
mm,
what I was saying about the Behe stuff does also illustrate another important point, which is that Popper wanted to claim that you could see aspects of Darwinism as what he called a metaphysical research program. And this is an idea which I think is really important. The notion here is that you have a problem, say, like the problems of design.
Mm.
And one programmatic approach would be to say, well, we could set about seeing whether what certainly appears to be a matter of design could actually turn out to be the product of variation and natural selection. But this is obviously a programmatic idea. That's to say, it suggests how, in principle, you might set about trying to find these things. And you can then, and this is typical of metaphysical research programs, engage in argument at two kinds of levels. On the one side, someone might say, yes, in principle, this sounds an interesting idea. But there are the following difficulties in principle about it.
Mm.
Or one might also equally say, okay, this seems programmatically quite an interesting and suggestive idea, but actually, uh, how successful has it been? To what extent have we actually been able to develop scientific explanations, detailed explanations, which really cash out this idea? And I think a lot of things really fall into this category. And if I can just say something on the side, I mean, there's a sense in which, if one takes seriously Popper's criticisms of the idea of justification, then much of our knowledge, I think, has this sort of character. And so if you ask about stuff that's going on in philosophy, arguments about the mind-body problem, free will, determinism and indeterminism, and so on and so on and so on, typically what you have are programmatic ideas which can be evaluated as to how does the idea in principle stand up to criticism so far? Does it in principle resolve the problems? And then second, you can ask, okay, how well have we got on with actually trying to explain things in this sort of way? So
Mm.
I think from that point of view, you can say, look, Popper's emphasis on testability and falsifiability are important, but equally our ability to evaluate things in terms of how well, in principle, would these things seem to resolve the problems we're dealing with, that can be evaluated, but in a softer kind of way.
Mm. So basically, Darwin is or the question is Darwinism is Darwinism scientific? It's basically an umbrella sort of. It has this umbrella character to it where you can, you can deduce from it specific predictions, like say for instance, due to geology and all, like whatever the famous JBS Haldane I think said that you won't find if you find a there's a problem if you find a rabbit in Cambrian rock or whatever it is. And
Yeah,
that's a prediction that can be put unless there was a an earthquake or something that screwed up what
sure,
happened there. But
sure. But I guess what I would say is, look, Popper argued for the importance of falsifiability.
mhm.
He argued, I think, more fundamentally, that we can't justify our claims to knowledge, but there may, depending on the type of claim we're making, be different ways in which it can be evaluated. But equally, one might say, okay, what currently are the alternatives? And
Mm,
here I did a bit of work some while back on the so-called intelligent design movement. And the big problem there seemed to me to be that they limited themselves typically to saying, well, we can't at the moment, or you don't seem able at the moment to be able to explain this in Darwinian terms. But it's possible, first of all, for a Darwinist to say, well, if that is a good issue, then we have to face that as an open problem. Let's see how we go with it. But
Mm,
equally, the person who favors Darwin can turn round to the critic and say, look, um, what are you offering as an alternative? If you look at the enormous amount of work that's been done on evolutionary approaches within biology, but also on generalizations of evolutionary approaches elsewhere, and the interesting explanations they've been able to come up with, what programmatically are you guys suggesting we offer as replacements for where we have explanations in principle about how things have worked or how explanations in detail might work? These things, because we're fallibilists, can be challenged. But in order to mount a serious challenge, you have to put up a competitor. And
mm.
I mentioned again the Behe material. The big problem there seemed to me to be that one ends up on his account of things to have an account that seems to make no sense at all. That's to say, of biological organisms as being things which, for the most part, you can explain in terms of natural selection, but where there are odd, pointless islands on his account of design. And
Mm.
I mean, I won't uh, say quite what I think about this, but it just seems to me that the big problem about this is that there's no rhyme nor reason about these things, about what where these things occur,
Mm.
or it just seems, in a certain sense, to make no sense. It's more, it's almost as if you had a Jackson Pollock painting, and then suddenly in the middle of it there were little bunny rabbits or something of this kind. You
Right.
say, well, if you're right about this, how on earth did they get there? But also, why did they get there when they make no sense in the wider context of things and so on?
Mm.
So this isn't a matter of saying if people don't like a Darwinian story, they should just go away. It's more a matter of saying, well, how's about offering us an alternative account,
Mm.
which looks at what, from a Darwinian perspective, can be explained, and then suggest, even in principle, how we might be able to do better with a competing approach.
Yeah, you have so Michael Behe is interesting because he is an intelligent designist. He wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box, which I've read, and his argument is this argument that's called irreducible complexity, where he basically makes the point, as you were mentioning, that if you get down to the granular level of evol or biology, at some point there's a region where there are certain objects, like cells or whatever, even beneath cells, like a smaller level, there is a level that you can get that you actually need something to happen, like God needs to intervene or whatever, or an intelligent designers had needed to intervene because it's too compl or he's basically it's an argument from ignorance, and he actually combats that within the book. Richard Dawkins calls it an argument from personal incredulity, which is basically the idea that I don't think that could ever happen, and I don't think we'll ever
Yeah.
figure that out. Therefore, I insert God into those moments, and that's
Well,
where it all, yeah.
that's right. But you see, there are two issues. I mean, first of all, it's perfectly respectable for any approach, and I think this is going to be the case for any general intellectual approach, to
Mm,
have, as it were, a wish list of problems which it would like to be able to offer explanations for, but which it can't so far. But that's
Exactly. Yeah.
something, but that is something different from being able to show that in principle one couldn't. But the second thing is that, as I was trying to suggest, that the difficulty with the Behe approach, apart from the fact that some of his examples have, since he wrote, been undermined, the big problem for me is that what he points to, suppose he was right, just seems to be a few random things which there seems to be no reason why, if there is a grand purposeful design, just these tiny little things, like the bunny rabbits in the Jackson Pollock picture, should be the sites of this. I mean, there's nothing to explain why these little bits and what they're doing in a sea of things that Behe seems to be perfectly happy to say could be the products of natural selection. I mean, it just doesn't offer us, as far as I can see, an intelligible picture. Now, this
Mm-mm.
doesn't knock Behe. This doesn't solve it. I mean, it poses a problem for him to respond to. It's not a refutation as such, but then I think this is how we have to look at everything in terms of competing research programs, whether people are offering us interesting resolutions in principle to problems with which we're concerned, and how is the debate going so far? Whereas the critics of Darwinism, but I fear a lot of this goes on in political argument as well, people are kind of after dramatic proofs or dramatic refutations, and they haven't, in a certain sense, understood what argument and what learning from one another is really all about.
Yeah, and also argument at the end of the day, there's no argument that's completely airtight. So, and there probably never will be. I mean, because that would suggest that you've reached a bottom, which is again, that's anti-Popperian because as Popper says, he makes this great analogy in I think it's Logic of Scientific Discovery where he says that the growth of knowledge is basically like you dig down into the bedrock, but you're never going to hit any bedrock, but you just dig down far enough to where you feel like you're
Yeah.
comfortable at that very moment. And it's also building upwards, but
Yes. Well,
you're
look, that's right. But I think a key thing from Popper's perspective is the issues to do with the sheer success of Newton's work up until when it was seriously challenged.
yes,
That's to
yeah, yeah.
say, one had uh, a theoretical approach which was remarkably suggestive and then successful. Problems were raised and they were overcome. It got to the point where people were seriously wondering whether Newton's ideas might, in some sense, be true by definition. I mean, that's to say, it acquired such a status that people felt this is dramatic, non-trivial knowledge about which we seem to be absolutely sure. And the lesson from that is, look, it is an incredible achievement, but like all human knowledge, it may in various ways turn out to be fallible. And if one bears that in mind, just the very idea that our aim should be with regard to knowledge to prove that something or other is correct, or that there is some issue if we can't demonstrate that it's true. That, I think, is something that Popper challenged in a really important and significant way. But it seems to me to be a lesson that, in broad terms, hasn't been learned and accepted. Because
Mm,
if it were, and if one then recognized that, we might learn in ways which we hadn't expected that any important and interesting idea that we had might be problematic. We need then to listen to other people, to be interested in what they have to say, rather than standing up and doing silly debating style arguments with them, trying to prove or disprove things that are substantive.
Yeah, I think that, and you're mentioning right there, that's sophistry. That's what Socrates was heavily against that, this idea of just debating tactics. He wanted to know what is true, and that's what Popper wants to know is what is true. The thing as a that I've learned from reading Popper is that uh, the I believe in reality. I believe there's a reality out there, and I believe that it's explicable, completely explicable, that we can explain this. And a lot of these, even if you took Newton seriously as if it was axiomatic, that means that you were taking on board the idea that you would never understand what the force of gravity actually was because he didn't explain the force of gravity. He simply explained the rotation. And then Einstein comes along and actually explains what's going on there. So he filled that gap, which is the curvature of space-time. We're actually just falling into things, and that was an amazing achievement. Again,
But
explainable. Yeah.
But they're also corrections. And I mean, if I can just say something about this,
Mm.
I used to teach philosophy at the Australian National University.
Mm.
And there is at the ANU, in the philosophy department, a quite well entrenched programmatic approach, which combines analytical philosophy with taking current science seriously. And
Mm.
it's respectable and interesting, but I had a disagreement with them, which was really to say, look, a key argument that's been offered by Popper and which one can illustrate from various episodes in the history of science is that we can find sometimes that we have really successful and illuminating theories which we subsequently wish to correct. And this may be a matter of theoretical or conceptual ideas which we've been working with, which we take now to be problematic, or it may indeed be the case that various things which we've taken as empirical confirmations of those ideas are things which you want to go back and question and refine. And this then, if this is right, has the implication that in principle, it seems to me, one needs to take current science seriously and the challenges that it poses to our previously accepted ideas, but we shouldn't simply lie down in the front, in the face of it, and say, oh, we just must simply assume that this is true. It's possible that we might want to say, well, it certainly seems to be successful. It's the best we've got so far. But it seems to me that in some respects it's problematic. Let us see if there's possibly an alternative way of looking at things which can accommodate these other issues, but also provide an alternative and better explanation of what we've got so far. And I would take, from a Popperian perspective, a key theme as being both respect and admiration for what's been achieved to
Mm-hmm.
date,
Mm-hmm.
plus also the notion that, well, still, it might be possible to raise questions about it or to challenge it. Not just in these debating terms, because on the face of it, if you take a Popperian approach, you're going to be interested in uh, difficulties or problems or empirical results which look as if they could pose questions for your approach where you hadn't expected them. And if someone comes along suggesting that they may have something from which you can learn, you should be really interested and welcoming and helping them to articulate it,
Mhm.
not sort of standing up and trying simply to knock them down. I mean, clearly, if they've just got something wrong, then, you might nicely try and point that out. But this idea that there is something problematic about or threatening about diversity or possible challenges seems to me to be something pretty bad and which we need to get over. I mean, I think it's got some fairly obvious consequences, for example, for current political debate,
Mhm.
where everyone seems to take the people who take a different view of things as their enemies. Whereas I would take it that from a Popperian point of view, want to say, well, I'm interested that you take a different view. Can you tell me something interesting or problematic about my views from your perspective? We should welcome it rather than wanting to debate them or worse.
Yeah. Although I would say the theoretical physicist David Deutsch, who is like the biggest proponent currently of Popper's ideas, and he just takes them radically seriously. He introduced this notion, he added to Popper's work this notion of good explanations, and his idea of a good explanation is something that's hard to vary. And for instance, like neo-Darwinism is extremely hard to vary in the sense that you can't change any aspect of it without it screwing up the complete explanation. And he says an example of a bad explanation is actually intelligent design because you can change everything about it and it works no matter what. And his point there is that we actually shouldn't waste our time with bad explanations. And I mean, I agree with him there. So with somebody like Michael Behe's claim or Stephen Myers or any of these intelligent designers, they're great at articulating what they do. And I actually find their books fascinating. And if nothing else, they're revealing from about a lot of things. But their ultimate claim is that there are certain aspects of reality that are inexplicable. And to me, that's just starting with a bad explanation that we shouldn't even invest time in because now you're claiming that we'll never be able to explain, in Behe's case, something that's so small that's irreducible. Like, I feel like we shouldn't even waste time with that. That's a dead end. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, I guess my view is this, that we should encourage people to raise interesting problems
Mm,
so that if someone says, look, have I got it right that you're suggesting that in principle we should be able to explain this in roughly the following terms, but then isn't there this sort of difficulty about it, then that, I think, is something which we should be open to and find really interesting.
mm,
But at the same time, um, that there are things which currently we can't explain. I mean, this is roughly the human situation. I
mm,
mean, that's to say there are two angles to it. I mean, first of all, it may be the case that what is being dealt with is something which is basically a programmatic idea, and where if it's programmatic, then that we haven't yet been able to develop an explanation along a particular lines is interesting, and it's something we need to put on our list.
mm.
If alternatively what's being said is, well, look, I'm just not sure that you could offer an explanation of it at all on the sort of basis that you're suggesting, then if that's right, then that is really interesting and challenging, but then it challenges us to come up with a new idea. I mean, let me give you a concrete example here.
Hmm.
Um, Popper, uh, in one of his papers, argued, it was talking really about the way in which programmatic metaphysical ideas could be criticized. And he gave as an example the way in which, in the physics of Descartes, you basically have hard corpuscles that kind of bounce off one another. Popper said, look, there's an interesting argument offered by Leibniz that in a way this just doesn't work. Why? Well, what you need to have, Leibniz was arguing, was something such that if two things are coming at one another, there has to be a certain amount of give or elasticity before they can react. And what Leibniz wanted to argue, Popper suggests, is that you have these programmatic ideas of Descartes, such that you have everything being explained by the motion of corpuscles in a void, and Leibniz suggesting that in principle, what you have to do is to think of there being things that are more like fields of forces, which would allow, in principle, for some compression. And now, one would have to look at the details. One would have to see what a follower of Descartes would make of this. But certainly, on the face of it, this is a really quite dramatically interesting idea. But it clearly is the sort of thing that needs to be explored, that if actually Leibniz's argument is right, then Cartesians who want to resist the substantive alternative that Leibniz was offering really then have to go and do some pretty creative work to see if they can find a way around it. But, and this is, I think, a key thing about all of this, that at any one point, in principle, both lots of people might be able to agree as to what the current state of the discussion looks like. They're not going to be able to agree as to whether any further pursuit of ideas and tradition of Descartes is completely hopeless, because the Cartesians say, no, I mean, you put up an interesting problem for us. We need to go away and think about that and consider how we can. But what they can do is to say, yes, as things stand, this is a genuine problem that's been raised. And I think it's in this way one can, everyone can hope to learn from polite exchanges between people who have different programmatic approaches.
I think that, yeah, I think that that's right, and I think that we as a people, and especially in light of recent events, politically and all, definitely need to learn how to use our language and be polite with one another and just in our interactions whenever it comes to debate but I think that I guess what David Deutsch was pushing against is the idea that not wasting time on bad explanations. Another example, I guess, would be that's a great example what you put forth, but those actually are really good theories and by monster thinkers. But then you have to nowadays we have to deal with ideas that are just simply silly on their face, and we need to notice these things pretty quickly so we don't waste time. An example would be the 9/11 conspiracy theories, like for instance the idea that the government was involved or Mossad was involved or something like that, or from the beginning I can just look at that and kind of just do away with that, because I'm like, well, clearly we know who was involved. It was these 19 terrorists, and it was bin Laden and all these other guys.
Yeah,
That's a better explanation in the sense that if any of that other stuff were true, if there was like bombs that were put into those buildings, like these are all real claims that people make.
yeah,
And before we don't have to even go along with that, because we just simply know that somebody would have spilled the beans now or something, because there's too many people that would have, come out and said, I was involved with that and this is what happened, and they would have been on a podcast or whatever. So I guess my point
But
is,
isn't
go ahead. I'm sorry. My
well, I was
point
going
is
to
that, uh, go ahead, Jeremy. I'm sorry.
what I was going to say was, look, isn't the key thing to get over to people, look, if you want to put forward an idea which challenges common sense, by all means, but what you need to do is to indicate how this can be critically appraised.
Mm.
And the big problem about most conspiracy theories is that people simply have an idea and then collect evidence that they reckon confirms it,
Right.
when this in itself is just worthless
Hmm.
unless you're advancing it in contexts in which what you're claiming can actually be appraised.
Hmm.
And part of the big problem, I think, is that people are still locked into this notion, well, into notions along the lines of saying, first of all, if I have a strong feeling that something is right, then it must be right. And second, of thinking that they can just prove that things are right and that they don't have any expectation of being able to learn things from other people. And I mean, conspiracy theorists, you're right about, but I think broadly speaking, the entire level of political debate at the moment is going on within this kind of mistaken epistemological assumptions, where people think that they're doing something useful when they simply stand up and spout various views or attempt with knockdown arguments to demonstrate that other people's views are wrong, rather than everyone approaching the issue in terms of thinking, okay, what are the problems? Does this tentative suggestion look promising? What are the difficulties? And how can I learn from other people where there are interesting problems or empirical difficulties and so on with my ideas?
Yeah, the last thing you just said there, that is how it should go. That's Popperian, the idea that fallibilism should be at the base of what we're doing, and a lot of people haven't taken fallibilism on board. I would say maybe, if I were to guess, maybe like 70% of the population doesn't do that. But
But there's a further twist to this, which is that in a certain sense, for this stuff to work, you have then, I think, to deal with a couple of problems. One of them is that we are dependent all the time on fallible expert knowledge. That's
mm,
to say, uh, expert knowledge may not be right. We've been talking about this before, but it's also the case that we're just crazy if we don't bear in mind that we have to depend on it, just because the fact that we feel strongly about something is neither here nor there in terms of truth. And expert knowledge typically has has the advantage to it that it's stuff which has so far withstood a fair bit of critical scrutiny in ways that our own prejudices don't. But there is then a further twist to all of this, which is that if you look at the development of what you could call the public sphere, one has had over time a fragmentation of shared knowledge and interchanges. So that in the US, one had for a long time three main television channels,
mm.
which just about everyone listened to. You could take them as supplying background information which you might question, which might surprise you about things, and so on. Then have a shift to cable television, to the internet, to social media, where there is then this vast fragmentation of discourse, and with social media, with built-in selection of stuff to fit people's prejudices rather than to challenge them. And
Right.
the consequence of this is that if you take the view that human knowledge is fallible, it's important for us to have sort of polite exchanges with people who can raise problems and difficulties. These days, you hardly encounter them. I mean, the figures of how many people even get their news from relative standard broadcast sources as opposed to podcasts and social media is going down and down.
Hmm.
And what this means is that regardless of how useful or wise or whatever our exchanges might be, the fact that it's taking place on a podcast is likely to mean that it might just as well have not be happening at all as far as
Right.
anyone's. So I think we're actually faced with a big problem. I mean, namely, if a Popperian approach to knowledge is right, we face a big institutional difficulty about how to get knowledge working like this when typically today people either go to rallies and hear all kinds of poor rhetoric and lies given to them by one side or the other of things, or they listen to podcasts and just have their own prejudices confirmed.
Right. No, I think you're exactly right. Let me see here.
Sorry, we got a little way away from Darwinism, but
No, no, it's completely fine because this is it kind of we're basically trying to use what we've built up so far within this conversation and applying it to the real world now, which is kind of what I would hope that everybody does whenever they learn about Popper. Something that I've learning about Popper has really just kind of changed my whole attitude about almost, I mean, really everything in a lot of ways. I mean, and I think certainly for the better. I'm going to ask you, I'm going to flag something really fast because we're
yeah,
running up on
sure.
we're running up on some time, but I'm going to say one thing and let's set it aside, but we'll come back to it, which is there's an interesting phenomenon within Popperians that I've noticed, and this is purely my opinion. So this isn't factual. This is nothing. This is something I've thought about. A lot of Popperians that I see, or people that proclaim to be Popperians, seem to be libertarians, which is interesting because um, I actually don't see a connection between Popperianism and libertarianism in the sense of modern libertarianism. Whatever that can mean a lot of things, but I think that what I mean is like extremely small government, almost revolutionary, which is that's clearly not Popperian because Popper was sort of against revolutions. If you read the Open Society and all, I'm going to say that right there. So I'm going to flag that. Let's circle back. But the last thing I'm going to ask about Darwin, we'll skip over a few things here, which is this. Uh, what did Karl Popper make an explicit connection between his epistemology and Darwinism? And which I mean the answer I think is yes to a degree, and I have objective knowledge right here.
Yeah.
Um, what is your thoughts on that? And do you think that well yeah, let me just ask that. Do you think he made an explicit connection and is that connection clear, or what are your thoughts on that, Jeremy?
Okay. What I'd say is this: back in the logic of scientific discovery, he drew a bit of a parallel between his ideas about the development of knowledge and natural selection. It was also the case that from when he was studying with Bühler and reading about the psychological ideas of the Würzburg school, he was impressed by their biological approach to psychology and perception.
Mm.
And this, it seems to me, then interrelated with the kind of naturalistic interpretations of Kantian ideas that were to be found in the work of Leonard Nelson and Fries, which he was engaged in debating a lot with Julius Kraft, a friend of his. And so there is this strong biological aspect to Popper's ideas about our understanding of the world. You get more explicit stuff about um, evolutionary approaches uh, brought out in, as you've mentioned, objective knowledge, but probably the fullest account is in The Rationality of Scientific Revolutions, which was a
Mm.
lecture that he gave in Oxford and which is now in The Myth of the Framework,
Oh,
and
okay.
where he then draws quite close parallels between his approach to epistemology and natural selection. All I would say about this is that some people looking at this kind of issue in Popper have said, well, is he then engaged in basing his epistemology on the results of a particular piece of science? And I think that the answer is no. I think that some of his earlier work is really speculative ideas about the psychology of perception and the psychology of understanding. Uh, the epistemological stuff has to be understood at a slightly different level, but where he wants to say that there are then parallels between the kind of learning that he thinks has to take place and argue and on the other side, the specific ideas which were developed as part of science within Darwinian approaches, towards which he's sympathetic. But I think myself that there are different layers here. And for example, Jeff Sampson, who was the co-editor of the Cambridge Companion to Popper,
Mm.
has a piece on Popper and Habermas, where he says, well, both of them really, in some respects, base their philosophical approaches upon scientific assumptions. And I don't think that that's right, and I think that one has to make the split. But I'm not sure. I mean, Popper brings out the parallels between the approaches in The Rationality of Scientific Revolutions. And there's a whole lot of other stuff which one can read in this way, but I don't think it's right to see Popper as basing his epistemology on particular scientific results.
Mm. Okay. That's interesting. Man, yeah. Okay, so to respond to that, I'm currently working on something that's connecting Popper heavily with Darwin, and the hard part about writing, and you've I'm sure come across this, Jeremy, is that I try to map out my book, and I've done it several times. I would just work on certain sections constantly, and I can't map it out because I'm constantly finding new things that completely destroy something I was already doing.
Okay.
And do you have this whenever
Yeah.
this is,
Okay.
and yeah,
It
go
is a
with this.
standard problem for if someone's writing a book or writing a PhD thesis.
Hmm.
And the key thing to be said about it's I think good advice that a PhD supervisor often gives to a graduate student. It's basically to say, look, your finished work will be unfinished. You have to
Mm.
reconcile yourself to that. You have essentially to decide what the plot of the thing is going to be. And then when you start to get ideas which are further interesting, make a list of these for your next book. Because
Right. Yeah.
because the problem otherwise is that your work on the thing will go on and on. And
Mm.
it's a bit like, I mean, in Scotland, there is a big bridge over the Firth of Forth, which runs from north of Edinburgh across a big inlet of the sea to part of Scotland, which is to the north of it. And it was always used to be said that the painters working on this had a never-ending job because by the time they got to the end of it, they had to start again. Now, there is a real risk that what you do will take on that kind of character so that it is never ready. And
Mm.
a further problem about it is that you may well find that you have certain ideas, and then you realize that there's an interesting spin-off or that other qualifications need, and you're then in a real mess on the grounds that the only person who could really understand this stuff is the person who's already read the first version of the book.
Right.
But the first version of the book doesn't exist because you're still mucking around with it. And so
Right.
I think the key thing to do is to say, right, I for now have to do this, and you can always write a final chapter and an introduction, which you do them last,
Right.
where
Yeah.
the final chapter can say, look, I've set out this argument, recapitulate it, but you can then say, as I suspect the acute reader will see, the following kinds of points can then be raised about it which demand further work.
Mm.
This is what I'm going to be doing next. And then you go back and write the introduction to the book in such a way that it provides an apology both for the book and for the last bit, and which points ahead to your next book.
So yeah, that's interesting. So the claim of my book, the claim that I'm making is that all Popperians are Darwinian and all Darwinians are Popperian, whether they like it or not.
Yeah.
And the thing is that it's this weird snake eating its own tail situation. And so this is what I'm working on. It's like this idea
Well,
that's, it's,
the other thing I would suggest is this. You may or may not know, but I'm currently running, based on Zoom, a couple of mini conferences a
mm,
year. And one thing to do would be to offer an outline of one line of argument or an outline of what in principle you'd like the book to be like in that context, because you could then see from feedback what people think is straightforward, what seems to require new sorts of argument, and what and there is always a difficulty about this. What you thought was straightforward, but turns out not to work.
right. Yeah, yeah. So
But
yeah, that's
uh,
amazing. Let me see here. Oh, so we have I don't know if are you able to do 10 more minutes, Jeremy, or
yeah,
no?
sure.
Okay,
Yes,
let's do
absolutely. Let's call a halt with that, except that with the 10 minutes, although I would like to return, but not necessarily on this occasion, to this issue of Popper and libertarianism
Yes, that's
that
what
you
yeah.
raised in passing. But this, I think, would be worth, if you could stand it, a further conversation specifically on that.
Oh, okay. You wouldn't want to that was actually what I was going to return to. Would you wouldn't want to do it right now,
Okay.
Jeremy? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I'm perfectly happy to talk a bit about that.
Okay.
Um, I guess I'd say three things about it. Um, First of all, consider Robert Nozick's Anarchy, State and Utopia.
Hmm.
The utopia bit of his Anarchy, State and Utopia offers an argument about the kind of social order that he has been arguing for up to that point on a completely different basis. it offers an argument in terms of saying this is an arrangement where, under some fairly simple rules, you can learn by way of trial and error.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't require that one goes with his unannounced theory of the basis of rights or a whole lot of his other earlier argument. You can couple that with a second issue, which is that Popper in the Open Society really gestures at a picture of democracy as operating by way of effective critical feedback.
Mm-hmm.
And an issue that can be raised about that is to say, well, how?
Mm.
Uh, and there are, as it were, two elements of this. On the one side, Popper has talked about the notion of the rational unity of mankind, the way in which pertinent information, particularly about how social arrangements work, how policy works, and so on, is scattered right through the practical experience and tacit knowledge of the entire population. We all typically have, from our own experience or from knowledge that we have of other people and their circumstances, stuff which could effectively feed back in raising problems and even suggesting improvements to how things currently work. But there doesn't appear to be a mechanism through which this actually operates. I mean, it's striking that in Britain there was a guy, quite a sensible, non-doctrinaire guy, who was a member of parliament and then a minister. And he wrote a book about, in many respects, his disillusionment with how politics was working. And he was saying, look, the big problem about it is that as a member of parliament or even as a minister, I'm just asked to endorse things that the government is telling me to vote for, rather than actually having the opportunity to discuss seriously
Mm.
what we should be doing. And there is an older line of criticism which goes back to an argument by a guy who is no friend of democracy at all, Carl Schmitt.
Mm.
And he said, look, there is this problem about liberalism and liberal democracy, which is that the people who favor liberal democracy take the view that parliamentary bodies or Congress or the Senate sort of works as a chamber in which learning takes place and in which people discuss things on the basis of their merits and so on. But in reality, he argued, and one could put it rather more strongly these days, but in slightly different ways, depending on what variety of institutions we have, that's not really how the institutions of democracy work in practical terms. And so I think the big challenge is what can we do in order that the institutions of democracy work a bit more like a Popperian open society. Now, I think what one can say in this context is that while it is far from ideal, there are certain ways in which uh, commercial institutions do pay great attention to what works, to critical feedback, to what customers will or won't buy. I mean, if one reads, say, stuff about the early development of Amazon, one of the
Mm.
really striking features of that is the sheer number of interesting ideas that people came up with, which were discarded because in various ways they didn't work out.
Mm.
And I think that while the notions that libertarians quite often are wedded to are somewhat fanciful, I
Mhm.
think that the learning mechanism side of stuff is significant, and where, I mean, clearly you can say, well, look, that doesn't resolve problems about uh, getting assistance to those people who need it and so on. But I start to worry. I mean, I was a permanent resident in the US for just over 10 years.
Mm.
And as a result, I was paying into Social Security, and a small part of my retirement at the moment is funded by Social Security payments, even though I gave up my green card. But one of the things that's very striking is that governments seem, broadly speaking, simply to have been unwilling to learn much about the demographics of their own societies. I mean,
Mm.
that's to say that it is, as it were, treated as a massive surprise that they're all of these old people and they are no longer working and they're living longer. Well, if this should have come as if this shouldn't have been a surprise to anyone, one would think it would be the government who would know all about this. But just in terms of what is politically easy to handle in terms of decision making within democracies, dealing with this sort of problem and avoiding, making grandiose promises to people which actually it's not clear how can be delivered on. You'd think, this is fairly elementary, but it's hardly something that anyone dares to say. I mean,
Mm.
if I were to become an American citizen again and were to stand for Congress, my platform was I'm going to be honest about Social Security.
Yeah,
And so I think it's not. I think that in these respects, libertarianism has lots of easy answers. I think that people tend to be very much too sanguine about the mechanisms of existing democracies and also with what could actually replace it. I mean, you get a lot of people saying, you just need freedom of speech for everyone. Well, freedom of speech is then interpreted as people yelling at one another,
yeah.
which
Right.
no one. I mean, if you just consider what certain well-known people in the United States have said about this, I mean, the people should essentially be free to say anything in circumstances where no one else has an effective comeback and where there aren't any sorts of preliminary checks in terms of, well, what actually is the problem situation? Is what you're saying even remotely? But uh, I fear not that libertarianism is an answer. I think that these kinds of issues, I think, explain why some people have been encouraged in that direction, just
Mm.
on the grounds that it's not very obvious quite how you do better than we've got. I mean, there may be models that do
Yeah,
better. I
yeah.
think in some respects, West Germany, well, I say West Germany until the ADF, but you have this further problem that in the current circumstances, and I think it goes back to these issues about the fragmentation of the media and so on, that you're getting into a situation sometimes where the electorate won't really take on board what the problems are that serious politicians are trying to address, and in consequence are attracted to various sorts of fantasies instead.
Mm. My thing
But
is that
still, you can,
yeah. Well, my thing is it seems like the modern libertarianism is sort of it attracts like a bug light neophytes, political neophytes, and um, what I mean by that is that it just seems like they want to, it's like anarchistic in the sense that they want to do away with they're confusing government with institutions and all this. And I'm like, and it's this idea that we wipe away, we actually want to, it just seems to me that they want to, not strengthen institutions, but weaken them and then populate them with good people that are on their side. And I'm sitting here thinking, like, well, wait a minute, though. This is anti-Popperian in the sense that Popper did away with the Platonic idea of who should rule, and he supplanted it with how do we make our institutions able to uh, uh, how do we make it where certain people can't do too much damage in these institutions or in our country? That should be, and that the idea there is strengthening institutions, not weakening them in a lot of ways. So it's like
yeah.
you're going to be at some point you're going to have bad people in government and everybody's fallible. So there's always going to be, so I feel like that
Well,
idea is being lost with modern libertarianism.
I I think that that's right, although it seems to me that if you look at what's happening in the US at the moment, if you'd asked people, 30 years ago, what is the characteristic of the American system of government, people would have said it is an effective system of checks and balances.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
Yeah.
that, in many respects, has gone, and where I think that you're right. I mean, one needs to improve on institutions, make
Mhm.
them work better, um, but also learn what one can from where other people have been able to do things rather better than us. I mean, there
Right.
is a
Yeah.
very strange thing, though, which is that, I mean, there was this, particularly in Britain, associated with Mrs. Thatcher. There were these ideas about deregulation and privatization, which were uh, reasonably effective and sensible. I mean, there's something to be said about the pros and cons of them,
Mm.
but it was which I won't bore you with now. But one of the striking features of that period was that some people got into their head that what you needed to do was to privatize. And where, for example, there was the attempt to privatize the railroad system or privatize the system of supply of water, dealing with sewage and other kinds of things. And and also we have in Britain an absolutely massive national health service. And
Hmm.
there were attempts to not exactly privatize, but to bring in market-like mechanisms to this. The difficulty about this was that there seems to me to have been very little theoretical exploration of what different ways of doing these things would be, and no willingness to operate in a kind of Popperian-like manner of learning by trial and error. And so you got sort of wholesale schemes being brought in some cases where it makes very little sense. I mean, that if you're dealing with pipeline type systems, I mean, like railways or water supply, a competitive system as such doesn't really seem particularly helpful. There might be ways in which you could introduce it. on the basis of a kind of the groundwork of another kind of system, but it needs a whole lot of thought and recognition that even our best and most attractive, at least to some people, ideas are probably going to be flawed, whereas they tended to go ahead with this as if they had, in some mysterious way, the answer to everything when it became perfectly plain very quickly that what they were trying out didn't in some ways work at all, but where they had no mechanism critically evaluating it and making changes.
Mm.
And I think that, some things, in respect of some things, market-based stuff works very well. In other cases, a lot of thought and a lot of built-in ways of learning by trial and error is necessary.
Mm.
One final note that I would offer you is I don't know if you know anything about the Disney town of Celebration.
Mm-mm. Disney Town of no, huh?
Celebration in Florida. Well, this might be a topic for uh, uh, another occasion, but uh, when Disney World was developed, they did a kind of dirty deal with the Florida legislature such that they got um, uh, powers like those of a county taken
Yes.
out of the kind of existing counties.
Now that you
Okay.
mention this, I'm aware of this. Yeah, yeah. Okay.
Okay. Now, one of the interesting things is that it allowed them to actually engage in certain kind of experiments which you can't really do in terms of regular suburbs or small towns.
Mm-hmm.
And what one got in this context were some things that worked well and others that didn't, but where there is an indication, I think, that offering a kind of privatized model of town provision is something that opens up some other kinds of interesting learning possibilities, although also a bunch of very interesting theoretical and practical difficulties as well.
Yeah.
And if you'd be interested in talking about this on a future occasion, I'd be very happy to do so.
Yeah, we'll have to dive into all of the politics because it's certainly we're not in a ultimately I feel like we're in a weird place right now that is just is getting harder and harder to navigate due to the the media fractions and factions and all this kind of stuff. But
Yeah.
fissures or whatever.
But
Um
this is clearly something for another occasion.
right. Yeah, yeah.
And if you want to do that and to have a segment which will discuss celebration and related issues, I promise then to wear my Mickey Mouse ears.
Yeah, there you go. I'm actually going to Disney World in like 3 weeks. So
Ah,
yeah,
well,
man,
I'll be back in the area in end of October,
okay.
but only to see celebration. I mean, basically, if you go to Orlando Airport, you have all of these. Is it Myers buses that go off to the
Oh yeah,
different? Well, they have one of these that goes not to the Disney World Cup, but to Celebration. And I will be on that bus going to see if some of the bad reports that I saw about difficulties that occurred in the about 2010, 2012 have now been overcome. It
wow,
may
okay.
just on grounds of age be my last visit, but at any rate, I'll be there to check this out further.
All right. Well, you'll be nearby. I'm a Floridian myself. But
All right.
all right, Jeremy, man, this has
Okay.
been awesome. And again, this is Jeremy Shearmur. Check out his books. I mentioned them at the top. And this has been great. And I will talk to you soon, Jeremy.
Thanks very much. I've enjoyed it very much, and there's a bunch of other stuff which would be fun for us to talk about. But
Absolutely.
let me call a halt here, and I hope everything goes well with actually mounting this.
All right. And we'll post this too on the Conjecture Institute. We'll probably post this, which is something I've become a part of. You can look into that.
Okay, if
And
you send me the relevant URLs, that would be much appreciated.
cool deal. All right, Jeremy.
Okay,
All right, later,
thanks very
man.
much.